Welcome to this episode of the ISF podcast from the Information Security Forum, the leading authority on cyber, information security, and risk management. I'm Tavia Gilbert, and I'm glad to welcome you back to another cutting-edge conversation tailored to CISOs, CTOs, CROs, and other global security pros. In every episode of ISF's media, CEO Steve Durbin speaks with rule breakers, collaborators, culture builders, and business creatives who manage their enterprises with vision, transparency, authenticity, and integrity. And he brings that conversation to you, your teams, and your partners. Today, Steve is in conversation with Tammie Jo Shults, retired Southwest Airlines captain and former naval aviator. Captain Shults received wide acclaim when, on April 17, 2018, she and her crew successfully landed a Boeing 737 after catastrophic engine failure and rapid decompression, saving the lives of 148 people. In today's conversation, Steve and Captain Shults discuss leadership and the role of hope and faith during a time of crisis, the importance of building trust with your team, how her parents' example led her as she navigated becoming one of the first female FA-18 Hornet pilots in the United States Navy, and more.
Certainly, I've read your book, Nerves of Steel. I've certainly read the briefing about your life to date. And I think some of the things that jump out for me is, you did become one of the first female FA-18 Hornet pilots in the United States Navy. Clearly, that wasn't easy to achieve. You do talk about that in some detail, and I'd like to explore that a little bit further. You then moved on after your Navy career to become a pilot for Southwest Airlines. So you're still flying, I understand, still enjoying it.
Well, I just recently retired.
Oh, you did?
So now I'm flying a Piper Malibu for Angel Flights, which is a volunteer position, but still flying. But yes, I just recently retired after 26 years with Southwest Airlines.
And indeed, many of our listeners or some of our listeners may be familiar with your story, particularly around Southwest. And I do want to come to that, what is probably certainly the most dramatic moment in your career to date anyway, if you're still flying. And I think I just wanted to start by positioning in it, because as I was reading your book, there was just a couple of paragraphs in it that really stood out for me that I think set the tone for where we are today to a certain extent, having to deal with the unknown, having to really cope with situations that we're unfamiliar with, which perhaps we wished wouldn't have happened. And so I'll just do that for a moment, if you'd bear with me. And it starts, the air pressure plummets and Darren and I can't breathe. The air conditioning system fills the cockpit with grey smoke just as the air is being sucked out of the aircraft and out of our lungs. I cannot see, I cannot hear, I cannot breathe. The good news, we're still flying, so it's time to get to work. And that for me just sort of encapsulates probably an attitude that so many of us are having to try to adapt to today in very, very challenging circumstances where for some, leadership perhaps is lacking. And so we're having to fall back on relying on a very practical, okay, let's just get on with it approach. And I want to go into that particular incident in some detail later. But before we do that, I'd like just to roll it back a little bit and understand, how did you actually become one of the first female fighter pilots in the Navy? What was the drive behind that for you?
I have to say, coming up through A7s first, which is an light attack aircraft, I always hesitate when people call me a fighter pilot. I don't think any A7 turned F-18 pilot ever calls himself a fighter pilot. I flew fighters, yes, but truthfully, part of being in the first class to have women in the F-18 community was timing. And I would have to give those that kind of blocked my path and made it a circuitous route to get there some of the credit. Because if I hadn't met so many no's and walls and fences along the way, I would have been there a lot sooner and I would have missed the opportunity. sometimes those adversities in life and the fences that we come up against and we have to circumnavigate, find a way under, find a different gate, you would be surprised when you look back, when you have time behind you and you look back, you realize, I would have missed it. I would have missed meeting my husband of 33 years. I would have missed having that window that just opened for me to go through F-18s and to be in the first weapons detachment in A-7s, to have women on the detachment. So those were doors that opened because of timing. Combat exclusion policy was being reviewed by Congress at that time, and they eventually lifted that for women aviators in the military. But timing was part of it, and sticking with it when there weren't accolades. And truthfully, I know this isn't necessarily sexy, but working at jobs that have no future in them, like cleaning hotel rooms, teaching swim lessons, selling hamburgers and French fries, keeping moving until you have a chance to get into the field you want to.
So there's a lot of, I suppose, self-belief that's required to do that, would you say?
You know, I came to know Christ just as I was leaving junior high, headed into high school. And I don't know about everybody's inner self, but I know that mine would be shifty enough that I don't know that I would have stuck with it if I didn't have that foundation of faith and that assurance that there are no second-class citizens. So whenever I was treated like one, I realized, no, that's an opinion, and I am more than what I do. And having Christ's perception of me, seeing my worth through his eyes, gave me staying power. I don't know that I would have had it on my own. I don't feel like I'm invincible in that way.
But certainly, and I think that there are probably some people who are listening to this podcast at the moment who can relate to that. Obviously, the ISF, I operate in an environment that is hugely still male dominated. If you look at the proportion of female chief information security officers, they're still in the minority. And yet at the same time, we are struggling with trying to find sufficient skills in the industry. And perhaps we're not targeting or opening the doors, rather, to some of the people that perhaps we should. And I was struck when I was doing some research for this discussion by another comment that was made by a lady called Melinda Dade, who is the CISO for the Texas Education Agency. And one of the comments she made about having now reached that position was that she felt she hadn't always been treated with the same respect as some of her male counterparts. And I find that very sad in an industry today in 2020 that we still have people who are struggling to overcome some of that. But that was pretty much more the norm, wasn't it, when you were struggling to become, a fighter pilot and to get into the air?
Yes, it definitely. I used to tell my folks, it baffles me that it's a noble pursuit for my male peers to become military pilots. But for me, I'm not getting much encouragement. But I will say that it was definitely always attached to the leadership. So if I had a good commanding officer, then we all got busy learning how to fly airplanes, which is challenging enough. But if I had a commanding officer that was a poor leader, then their personal opinions came into play and their egos. And so people rise to or sink to the ethics and character of a leader. So it was really always leader driven, whether I was accepted or not. And we just got busy with flying rather than positional posturing.
Mm-hmm. You said something interesting there. I think you said, it depended very much on whether they were a good leader or not. Tell us a little bit about what is a good leader. What do these individuals look like? How would you identify a good leader?
I had the advantage of having good leaders at home in my parents. And so I had this foundation of what a leader should look like, a great profile, very servant style leadership. And then becoming a Christian and reading through scripture, you see that is God's style. That is what Jesus laid down his life to prove, the servant leadership style. And, to break that down, because I've had people along this path ask me, well, what is a servant? Break that down. What does that look like? And I think part of that looks like having fun with hard work. The idea that it's something to avoid is where you lose your joy, I think, in work. And as leaders, not just assigning tasks and responsibilities, but giving that authority to go with it so that the person that has that responsibility, they're invested. It's not their chore, it's their part of contributing to the work at hand. And knowing your craft and knowing your people. I often see, and I didn't just arrive at it, I certainly had great parents that showed me a wonderful profile of what a leader is, and never being too busy to explain what the task was, and do it with us until we felt comfortable doing it. But also in coming through a couple of decades of either being captain or division officer and having the responsibility of making these tight, small teams in a hurry. Sometimes as a captain for a commercial airliner, you have maybe 5 minutes to make a cohesive team out of your flight attendants, your cockpit crew, and even the ground crew that's assisting loading people and fuel and cargo. And realizing that if you don't have a little bit of understanding of what they're doing, it will be hard to be a good leader for that. And also, this is probably my best advice to our son, who plans to be a pilot and has already started on that path, but also to others in a leadership position, is making sure that there's not just a monologue from us, the team leader, that there's questions involved, that Socratic method of getting a conversation going so that that dialogue creates this bridge from both sides of the river. And I hear about things so much sooner from my flight attendants, from the ops agent, from the ground crew, if I've already had a little bit of dialogue with them. And if you have time to listen to a kid's soccer game experience, look at a baby picture, things like that, they're not going to hesitate when it comes to telling you something with a mission that is possibly a problem, not yet, but can we look at it? So that's what I've found in my small team leadership positions.
It's about being human, isn't it? It's about actually just taking an interest in the people for what they are. And I think that one of the challenges that certainly people talk to me about at the moment in the sort of situation that we're in, where around the world, a lot of people are still in lockdown, a lot of people are still unable to go about doing their jobs in the way that they were used to doing it. They're having to deal, as we are now, of course, by doing it using Zoom or Teams or whatever it might be. And all too often, we lose sight of the fact that perhaps because we're using technology, that there is actually an individual on the other end. There's a person. And I think one of the real arts of leadership is being able to just step back yourself and to put yourself in the other person's position and really trying to understand where they might be coming from at any one point in time, from a position of integrity, from a position of being really genuine. Because that then builds so much more rapport, and therefore, as you were just saying, gets a much better reaction from the team that you're working with, from the individuals, should it come to a position where they have to do something that perhaps is out of the ordinary. You obviously have still been able to fly during the pandemic. How has that changed? I mean, how have you, presumably you've had to deal not just with some of the anxiety from your crew, but also from passengers?
One of the things that I would say I noticed at Southwest was the gratefulness for a job. When what we have every day is suddenly threatened, we realize, okay, it's worth getting up at 1:30 in the morning to get to work. That whole idea of just even having a job was reviewed, and I think our appreciation for having work was renewed. Now, obviously, it was kind of sad to go to the airport, which is usually busy and bustling with people, and it be very quiet. People have realized that life does need to go on. I was reading the book, The Great Influenza, just curious about how do we go from World War I, this horrible influenza that targeted the young and healthy mortally, to the roaring 20s here in the US. And part of it was realizing you take care of the vulnerable, but the healthy need to move on. and keep our economy going. Economy trickles down to people having food and shelter. So it's not just about earning a dollar. It's about having what we need to continue. And then our school children needing to keep moving in their education. So as it has struck your nation, it has struck ours, that there's a renewed appreciation when you do have work, and certainly hoping to get back into everyone having work to go to, school to go to, and the resources that we need to live, not just everything that we want, but the things that we need.
And that brings me back to how I really started this, by referring to that passage where I ended it with you saying, now it's time to go to work. So tell us a little bit about what happened on April 17th on Flight 1380.
Well, Darren and I had met the day before and flown together for the first time. And then the flight attendants that morning, we met them at the aircraft. And we had a little time. I usually bring coffee to my crew when I meet them in the morning, or breakfast tacos, whatever is available at the airport. And that, I think, has been an important step for me. Even if they don't drink coffee, even if they don't want a breakfast taco, it pulls people together in a natural way, and you start conversing before you hit the points of weather, loads, what path are we taking? Are we crossing any big storms today? What can we expect? And having that natural draw rather than the PA come to the front for the captain's briefing. Mm-hmm. And so in doing that, we realized a little bit more about each other just through those comments. Even before we took off after the first flight, Nashville to LaGuardia, we had some time on the ground in LaGuardia, and instead of people getting plugged into their headphones or their social media or emails, the things that can keep us busy but not in the moment, everybody pooled together in the front galley to continue our conversation that we'd had, and realized that all of my flight attendants were women of faith, and learning a little bit more about Darren. We sat together, a foot and a half apart for a day, and you're just often pretty busy with the task at hand of flying, and learned that he was a Boy Scout troop leader. And so when we took off from LaGuardia, beautiful day, full of passengers, heavy with fuel, headed for Dallas, all seemed well. And around 32,000 feet, about 20 minutes into the flight, we felt an explosion before we heard it. And then the minute we heard it, the aircraft experienced a jolt, kind of like what you would imagine a Mack truck makes when it hits the side of something. Darren and I both thought we'd been hit by another aircraft. The jolt was so violent, and the nose pitched over. We went into a snap roll to the left, and the aircraft skidded sideways. We gained control of the aircraft and brought it wings level upright, and let it continue descending, because we knew without one engine at that high of altitude, we couldn't maintain altitude. We'd depart the aircraft if we tried. So we allowed it to continue the dive, but all the things that happened all within 1 second, less than a second of time, is what I just told you. And then we could see the engine instruments rolling back on number one, meaning we lost number one, which is the captain's side engine. And then there was this shuddering that ensued, and a roar that engulfed every sound, and we couldn't breathe. There was a stabbing pain in our ears, and realized the smoke wasn't the only thing that caused seeing or breathing hard to do. And so we knew that we'd had a rapid depressurization, and somewhere there was a big hole in our aircraft. And with the smoke involved, fire is always something that you want to be proactive about. So I shut down the engine within, I think, the first 30 seconds, meaning just turn off the fuel source and things to that number one engine. We got our masks on so that we could breathe, and then we headed towards Philadelphia. I would say that adrenaline it pumps in, I think, to everyone in a situation like that. And while it can make you think very fast in a small moment in time. It doesn't give you any epiphanies of new information, but I do remember getting on that speed train of thought of, I don't know that everything we need is going to stay on this aircraft until we get it to a runway. And of course, that sends you straight for those mental cliffs of what if. And the what if would be, then this might be the day I meet my maker. And that's when that speed train stopped. And I just stepped back with that calm, realizing, well, I won't meet a stranger then. I meet with him every day. And I turned around and had, I feel like, that calm that I needed to be creative and decisive in the decisions and ability to fly for the next 20 minutes. An aircraft that kind of had an unscripted combination of emergencies all the way down. The tearing and ripping of parts never quit until we landed. We were about 10,000 pounds overweight for landing, so our landing was a one shot only. And as we got closer, we realized we were more of a glider than we knew. We couldn't use very much of that power on the right side, which we had anticipated, because the drag on the left pulled us to the left. The power added, of course, pushed us to the left, and airplanes don't fly well sideways. So we had to use different methods to keep our airspeed up and make the runway.
And you did land successfully. I mean, unfortunately, it wasn't without loss. You did, unfortunately, lose one passenger, presumably because of the initial impact in the air rather than anything else. But other than that, you and the team got everyone home safe that day. What would you say, Tammie Jo, looking back, that you really learnt from that experience?
It's interesting, Steve, to me that at the end of the day, all the aviation skills that we pulled from deep within to make all the decisions and then remake some of those decisions as we had new information and realized some of the degradation of the systems that we had. It wasn't the aviation lessons that were forefront in any of our minds. It was the human element. And I remember that very day kind of boiling them down to three things: habits, hope, and heroes. And the habits from faith to flying came to bear that day, and realizing that habits on a good day become instinct on a bad day. And we've been given this generous gift of choice of what we make a habit and thus an instinct. And hope, I just applaud so many of those in the back, starting with my flight attendants, Rachel Fernheimer, Catherine Sandoval, and Shanique Mallory. You know, when this happened, they buckled up like they should. But when they heard the announcement that we're not going down, we're going into Philadelphia, they unbuckled and headed down such a rough aisle that they had sprained back, bruised ribs, cuts. And because they did that, other passengers started looking around to see how they could help. Andrew Needham, Tim McGinty, and Peggy Phillips. And so we saw this very unusual fact that hope doesn't always change your circumstances, but it does change you. And that change in you can change the circumstances. Not all of them, but that was probably our biggest takeaway that day. And then heroes. I saw many that day, and so many of them had no title, no equipment. They were just people who took the time to see and the effort to act on behalf of someone else. I've since realized, I don't think they were heroes for the first time that day. I think they've made a habit of giving hope to other people.
I suppose if we look at the situation that we're in today, I mean, it bears no resemblance to what you've just talked about, of course. It's entirely different. But I think some of the habits that people are calling upon are certainly comparable at a certain level. Some of the things that people are having to do within organizations when people fall ill. Some of the people listening to this may well be in a security environment where they'll be making linkages with what you're talking about with similarly dramatic instances in their worlds, which could be a security breach, for instance, where all of their systems suddenly go down. And it's that training, it's the habit, it's the instinct, it's the working with other people, it's, I suppose, the trust as well of that there are other people who can do some of these things that will get you through to a situation where you can return to a degree of normality. And so I think it's very interesting to hear you talk about that within that context, which, of course, many people listening will hope that they never have to deal with, particularly if they fly a lot, as I do, or as I did before everything got shut down. Would you say that it made a very significant difference to you as an individual? I mean, how different are you, if at all, today because of that?
Well, I have to tell you, I've had other situations where aircraft did not behave well. And at the time, of course, we kind of resent when things don't behave as they should. But that was a big help in handling Flight 1380. When you go through situations like that, it burns the dross off of life in a good way once we come through the situation itself. And I know different passengers and crew dealt with it differently after we got on the ground. And I had such an advantage in having a husband that has flown everything I've flown. We've kind of been in aviation lockstep through our careers in the Navy and at Southwest. He's a Southwest captain. So having that sounding board at home was very helpful. But it's been interesting in that it does peel away some of the things that you thought were important that aren't. I'm much more dedicated in keeping the priorities in my day a priority. What you get done in a day, you get done. And I still stay up till midnight sometimes getting my work done. But I have to say, one of the things I've noticed about all the different heroes that I saw that day, whether they were crew members or passengers, it doesn't altogether matter the equipment you have. If you don't have the right propulsion behind it, it's useless. So you can have the greatest ability to help someone, and if you don't step up and do it, it's mute. I think about Andrew Needham, a gentleman, he was an EMT on our flight with his family, and he looked around and saw that there was a young mom with a 6-month-old and getting 2 oxygen masks on, and a 6-month-old who is really a handful because of all this noise. And it went from 70-degree weather inside to -25 outside coming in. And so there was just a lot that was disturbing going on, and this mom was having such a hard time not able to get the oxygen mask on this little 6-month-old. And Andrew unbuckled, and when I say unbuckled, believe you me, it was a rough ride, and went over and helped her a number of times till everything got settled. And then I believe Rachel Fernheimer, one of my flight attendants, helped her as well. And there were so many different stories that it's often within our grasp to be a contributing member. It's just, are we going to take that choice?
And I think that is really a pretty good summation of where we need to be, isn't it? I mean, what is the role of the leader? The role of the leader is to create the environment within which people can behave in the way that you've just been describing, whether things are going well, whether they're going badly, or things are completely out of the norm. And just before we close here, Tammie Jo, and it's been fascinating talking to you. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this. What are just some final points that you would want people who are listening to take away from what we've been talking about?
I think something that was a great takeaway for me, and I don't think it's age related, I think it's life. And that is when we come up against adversity, which I think our world is at that point of, there's quite a bit of adversity with borders, businesses, schools closing all over the world. And then trying to get back into what is safe, what is not. And what do we believe, and how do we act? I know it's even awkward among friends sometimes when you get together, even though you're outside and it's a little windy, are you wearing a mask? Are you hugging? Or are you not hugging? In our town, I have to tell you, our mayor at first, when he came out and said, all right, you all, maintain 6 feet. And people were very respectful of that. But after, they hugged each other. And then they stepped back 6 feet, And so our mayor came out and said, stop hugging. And I thought, what a great little town to be from, where the mayor has to say, stop hugging each other. But I do think that adversity that we meet along the way is part of our grooming. It's part of what prepares us. And I don't think it prepares us just for ourselves. I think that's what prepares us to make a difference. And in this time when it's very easy to have our eyes turned inward and how can I survive or how can I get on top of this? Often, if we get our eyes sweeping side to side in a scan that goes beyond self, we'll find it's a lot easier to rise up above adversity when you're not doing it by yourself. And helping other people can sometimes help you more than you help them.
I think that's a great way to close. Tammie Jo, thank you very much indeed. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, thank you, Steve.
I had the pleasure of narrating the audiobook edition of Tammie Jo Shults' memoir, Nerves of Steel, so I've spent a lot of time with her story. I really admire this humble leader and hope her model of leadership through service, establishing authentic, caring connections with her colleagues, and building trust and mutual respect is as inspiring to you as it is to me. In our next episode, Steve speaks with Dame Inga Beale, another breaker of the glass ceiling. She's the former CEO and the first female CEO of Lloyd's of London. Steve and Dame Inga discuss the role that listening played when she assumed leadership of Lloyd's, a business institution with a 300-year-long history, the courage and effectiveness of simplicity in communication, a new style of leadership built on trust, and more. Here's a preview of Dame Inga Beale.
You are much more likely to get trust, loyalty, followers if you show some vulnerability. And as the CEO, it can be very difficult sometimes to admit you got something wrong. It can be very difficult to admit you're anxious about something. But if you come out and declare that, you usually see huge benefits. People like it. They want to see you as being really authentic and genuine. And to show that vulnerability can be a wonderful leadership trait these days.
We look forward to bringing you the full conversation. In the meantime, we invite you to tune into our catalog of video and podcast episodes, all of which you can find at securityforum.org. If you feel like today's conversation was of value, you can subscribe to the audio feed wherever you get your podcasts, and we'd be so grateful if you'd recommend us. Growing our subscriber numbers helps us reach new audiences and helps us continue to bring you these timely discussions. You can always join in the conversation on our LinkedIn page at linkedin.com/company/information-security-forum, or get in touch directly through our website, where you can also download ISF's research, practical tools, and guidance related to discussions like these. The ISF podcast is produced by Talkbox and Tavia Gilbert. Music by Alexander Filipiak. Assistant producer, Katie Flood. Mix and master by Brian Barney. Thanks for listening.